So, back for another video in my car on my lunch break. This one is going to be on the beginnings of American imperialism and the Boxer Rebellion, because I've been reading and doing some research on the Boxer Rebellion because it's pretty fucking cool. And I have my notes with me because I wanted to actually make sure I make these points here. But to start off, primarily the beginning of American imperialism begins with the end of the British century, around the turn of the I would say 1880s pretty much. And the end of the British century would basically come about because of Britain's recognition that they have overextended their empire, their globe-spanning empire. It's becoming a lot harder and harder to maintain this security and act as basically the world's policeman. They realize that they can't do this alone, and so they turn to the Americans, and that is mostly because of the racial idea, or the idea of the racial superiority of the Anglo-Saxons, of the white men. And I had a quote here by Rudyard Kipling. He wanted the Americans to take the white man's burden, as well as the American imperialist Albert Beveridge. He claimed, we are a conquering race. We must obey our blood and occupy new markets, and if necessary, by force. And this sort of idea, or this sort of philosophy, that it is in our blood as the white race to go out and conquer, as manifest destiny. This the same ideology that American settlers used to commit genocide against the Native Americans and place the Native Americans into reservations. And it was this sort of idea that led not only for the Americans to annex Hawaii, but also to go to war against Spain, because at the time Spain was basically a collapsing empire. You had the revolutions in South America. You also had the ongoing war in the Philippines for Filipino independence, as well as overall basic just disintegration. And the American imperialists saw this and wanted to basically take over Spanish possessions in the Pacific as well as the Caribbean, because the American policymakers viewed the Caribbean, not both the Caribbean and the Pacific, as this sort of new market that the quote by Beveridge I just read. And this new market was basically finding new ways of finding new resources to exploit for exploitation. And you saw this specifically, as I'm talking about the Spanish-American War with Cuba. Americans allowed for Cuba to maintain independence primarily as an American economic colony. And as well as, Guam, Puerto Rico, as well as the Philippines too. The Philippines, which were fighting their own war of independence against the Spanish, allied themselves with America on the belief that the Americans would grant them independence following the end of the war with Spain. As we all know, this didn't happen. America, after not really a debate on the subject, just annexed the Philippines outright, which began a war with the Philippine guerrilla movement. And then eventually, as time went on, this sort of idea of the yellow peril, the fear of Asian, Orientalist view on Asia, which came from the Europeans after the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, because Japan had modernized at this point, and the Germans, it was the German Kaiser who coined the term the Yellow Peril after the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. But the First Sino-Japanese War and the militarization and the modernization of Japan basically made the Europeans really anxious over the idea of a Asian uprising against the West, and that idea comes from the Orientalist view on Asians as a whole. And at the time in America, you had the Asian Exclusion Act, and you also had a lot of racial views on Asians that came from Darwinism, because a lot of Americans at the time viewed Asians or Chinese, just Asians in general, as like, you know, barbarians, as the Yellow Peril and all that. So these racial ideas, coupled with the idea of the racial superiority of the white man, of the Anglo-Saxon, these all coalesced into what would become eventually the century of humiliation for China. And that began with, you know, the Opium Wars, which, as I was going to get into next, America basically, it was an American encroachment in the Pacific. It all began with the expedition to Korea in the 1871, with the Battle of Gwangha, in which an American diplomatic expedition, it was fired on by Korean forts, which led to an American attack against the Korean forts. But that never really went anywhere for America, like projecting their imperial power. But it sort of set the blueprint for how America would act towards other powers in the Pacific as well as in the Caribbean. And as I was speaking of before, the Opium Wars, which were nothing but an imperialistic war by Britain to force China to allow British access to Chinese markets, as well as the selling of opium. And that's where, you know, Britain got their port cities like Hong Kong. But I was going to touch on how, after the end of the First Opium War, the first formal treaty signed between the U.S. and China, the Treaty of Wanghe, it was basically, the treaty granted the United States most favored nation status, as well as extraterritorial rights and access to treaty ports. And so this sort of basically set America into China, basically allowed, as well as with other foreign powers, access to Chinese markets. That would also come about in the form of the Tianjin concessions, which the Tianjin concessions were a series of concessions by the Empress Dowager, which basically, you know, after the end of the First Opium War, you had the Second Opium War. The name Tianjin concessions is like basically it's an overarching term for a series of concessions made by the Chinese government to foreign powers. And the series of concessions that I'm referring to was the first one was made in the 1860s, and it went, I think the last one ended in 1943. That was the last. There were 9 of these concessions made by the Qin imperial government to foreign powers. But basically, you had the Treaty of Wanghe, which granted America access to Chinese ports, which were held by foreign powers, as well as granted the United States the special nation status and extraterritorial rights. You also had the Tianjin concessions, which, again, even more so, granted territorial rights not only to the United States, but also other foreign powers, as well as access to the Chinese markets. And then you had the United States' open door policy, which even more so enforced American, or not really enforced, that's not the word I was trying to say, but entrenched American hold in Chinese markets and strengthened their position within Chinese markets. And the U.S. the open door policy was basically I wrote it down. Sorry. Yeah, it was basically John Hay. He issued the open door policy in 1899. And that, like I said before, this open door policy basically, it was meant to, on paper, it granted equal rights to all other foreign nations, and it was meant to not allow any other foreign power to have more trading rights than other nations, but it basically just entrenched and strengthened America's position in the Chinese markets as well as other foreign nations within the Chinese markets. And on top of all of these you have the economic factor, you have the racial factor, you also have the religious factor, because as well as with the opening up of China and Japan and a lot of areas in the Pacific and in Asia, you also had the bringing of Christianity and, the spread of Christianity. And this played a huge factor within the Boxer Rebellion, because France, who had conquered Indochina, they received a series of concessions as a part of the Tianjin concessions. And part of these concessions given by the Qin imperial government to the French was the French were the protectors of Catholicism. And so they wanted the Qin imperial government they demanded that the Qin imperial government protect Chinese Christians as well as Christian missionaries and Christian settlements and churches. And the Qin government accepted this, and this led to a large mass of anti-foreign or mostly anti-Christian sentiment, because this was a complete upendment and disintegration of Chinese culture, because a lot of these Christian missionaries and Christian settlements were moving into old Chinese temples. And so a lot of the early anger was targeted at foreign power, at these foreign Christian missionaries. And so the Boxers, in a sense, were national liberation movements targeting foreign occupations. And eventually this would coalesce into a series of murders against foreign diplomats. You had the killing of the Japanese minister, and then the German minister, which then led to the eventually there was they laid siege to the foreign litigations in Peking, and afterwards the coalition or the coalition force attempted to lead an expedition, but they were defeated at the Battle of Laofeng, and they withdrew. And after they withdrew, I'm pretty sure it was the same foreign coalition force, but they captured the Daigao forts. And at this time, there was a lot of the Qin imperial government did not necessarily support the Boxers, because they viewed China as needing necessary modernization, and so they wanted to support a lot of the modernizing efforts that were being done by the foreign powers. And so there was a lot of interfactionalism between imperial court members as well as the more large peasantry, because that's where a lot of the Boxers came from. It was a large peasant-based movement. But that's pretty much what I wanted to speak on. All in all, the beginnings of American imperialism was something that was birthed out of a belief in a racial superiority over us against them. It is the same thing that has led Americans to commit the most horrendous atrocities against innocent civilians, against people's own cultures, against people's own nations. This belief in our own superiority has led us down paths of bloodshed, and it still is. It's still working now, and it has always been there. You know, like, from the beginning of Manifest Destiny, the belief that our racial beliefs and our own superiority against others have basically been the death of the American dream as a whole. Like, the beginnings of our country, the first migrations to the United States by colonists were done out of the necessity of religious freedom. And so, again, I'm not saying the Pilgrims and the Native Americans lived happily together together. The Pilgrims and, Pilgrims. The first settlers, they still committed atrocities against the Native Americans. I'm not trying to justify, the first settlers of the United States. They still committed atrocities, but at the same time, a lot of the first settlers within the United States were leaving behind a lot of the prejudices and a lot of the beliefs that had been forced upon them from Europe. A lot of the more traditional beliefs from Europe that they were trying to leave behind and come to a new world, to establish something new that they believed in their hearts would be something, something beautiful in a sense. But that idea was degraded even, I would say, only a couple of years after the settling of Jamestown. That idea was lost because of the simple fact that we believed ourselves to be superior than everyone else that wasn't white, pretty much. And I'm not trying to make this, down with the white people. It's not really that. I'm just trying to make the point that American imperialism and the movement of American imperialism is not only driven by the necessity by the capitalist to acquire resources, to exploit developing nations to get said resources. It is also driven by a cultural, racial idea of superiority over someone else. Like how Americans view the Middle East, or how Americans view any country, like Latin America, for example. The saber rattling by Donald Trump towards Nigeria, and how a lot of these alt-right Twitter accounts have been making blatant racist views on Nigerian and the Nigerian military, and the whole build-up against Venezuela. The idea that someone's country that is not white, and that is the purpose for why they're not white, or the purpose for why their country is degrading is because they're not white, is an idea that has been with not only the United States, but the West as a whole since our founding, since we discovered that there were other nations outside of ours, since the beginning of British imperialism, since the beginnings of American imperialism. We have always held the belief that we are better. But that's basically what I wanted to talk about. Pretty long, but hopefully you enjoyed. Pretty heavy topic, but shit like this needs to be talked about, I guess. And what better way for it to be talked about than me sitting in my car on my lunch break at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I'll see you.